Present, she dared not mention Wickham's name, but Elizabeth instantly comprehended that he was uppermost in her thoughts, and the various recollections connected with him gave her a moment's distress. But, exerting herself vigorously to repel the ill-natured attack, she presently answered the question in a tolerably disengaged tone. While she spoke, an involuntary glance showed her Darcy with a heightened complexion earnestly looking at her, and his sister overcome with confusion, unable to lift up her eyes. Had Miss Bingley known what pain she was then giving her beloved friend, she undoubtedly would have refrained from the hint, but she had merely intended to discompose Elizabeth by bringing forward the idea of a man to whom she believed her partial, to make her betray a sensibility which might injure her in Darcy's opinion, and perhaps to remind the latter of all the follies and absurdities by which some part of her family were connected with that corps. Not a syllable had ever reached her of Miss Darcy's meditated elopement. To no creature had it been revealed, where secrecy was possible, except to Elizabeth, and from all Bingley's connections her brother was particularly anxious to conceal it, from that very wish which Elizabeth had long ago attributed to him, of their becoming hereafter her own. He had certainly formed such a plan, and without meaning that it should affect his endeavour to separate him from Miss Bennet, it is probable that it might add something to his lively concern for the welfare of his friend. So, Caroline's comments backfires because by bringing up the regiment where Wickham is, she means to just make a dig at Elizabeth and kind of suggest that she was interested in Wickham at one point, and also how silly her sisters acted in front of all the militia men. But it's very uncomfortable for Georgiana because this is the man that she almost eloped with and ran away with. Of course, Caroline doesn't know that. This is a very secret issue. The only person who didn't have to know about this situation, who does know about it, is Elizabeth, because Darcy wrote to her in the letter to clear some of her misconceptions. So Elizabeth knows that this is a really uncomfortable topic. Georgiana looks down and she's overcome with confusion. She's unable to lift up her eyes, so she's very upset and distressed by the mention of Wickham. Mr. Darcy kind of looks at Elizabeth, and there's a little bit of a silent conversation between the two of them because he's obviously concerned for his sister, and hoping that Elizabeth will kind of handle this situation with grace. Elizabeth's collected behavior, however, soon quieted his emotion, and as Miss Bingley, vexed and disappointed, dared not approach nearer to Wickham, Georgiana also recovered in time, though not enough to be able to speak any more. Her brother, whose eye she feared to meet, scarcely recollected her interest in the affair, and the very circumstance which had been designed to turn his thoughts from Elizabeth seemed to affix them on her more and more cheerfully. So Elizabeth handles this beautifully. She doesn't give in to Caroline's petty attack. She's able to avoid talking about him. And because Caroline won't bring up Wickham in particular, Georgiana's okay. She's not okay enough to talk again, but we already know that she's very shy and nervous. And instead of making Mr. Darcy think less of Elizabeth, he thinks more of her because of how gracefully and how thoughtfully she handled this situation. Their visit did not continue long after the question and answer above mentioned, and while Mr. Darcy was attending them to their carriage, Miss Bingley was venting her feelings and criticisms on Elizabeth's person, behavior, and dress. But Georgiana would not join her. Her brother's recommendation was enough to ensure her favor. His judgment could not err, and he had spoken in such terms of Elizabeth as to leave Georgiana without the power of finding her otherwise than lovely and amiable. When Darcy returned to the saloon, Miss Bingley could not help repeating to him some part of what she had been saying to his sister. So, when Elizabeth leaves, of course, Caroline makes fun of her and starts digging at her to Georgiana, but Georgiana won't join in because Mr. Darcy's already told her how great Elizabeth is, and she trusts her brother's opinion. "How very ill Eliza Bennet looks this morning, Mr. Darcy," she cried. "I never in my life saw anyone so much altered as she is since the winter. She has grown so brown and coarse. Louisa and I were agreeing that we should not have known her again." However little Mr. Darcy might have liked such an address, he contented himself with coolly replying that he perceived no other alteration than her being rather tanned, no miraculous consequence of travelling in the summer. So again, Caroline's reflecting some unfortunate attitudes of Regency England. It was perceived that if you were pale, you were not of a working class and you could stay inside and not let the sun hit you. So oftentimes being more tanned would be associated with being of a lower social class, which is very flawed. But Mr. Darcy doesn't care. He's just like, no, she's been traveling around in the summer. She's gonna be tan. So he doesn't rise to the bait. But Caroline is getting to a point of desperation, even if she's not quite desperate yet. For my part, she rejoined, I must confess that I never could see any beauty in her. Her face is too thin, her complexion has no brilliancy, and her features are not at all handsome. Her nose wants character, there is nothing marked in its lines. Her teeth are tolerable, but not out of the common way. And as for her eyes, which have sometimes been called so fine, I never could perceive anything extraordinary in them. They have a sharp, shrewish look, which I do not like at all, and in her air altogether there is a self-sufficiency without fashion, which is intolerable. So also Caroline doesn't like Elizabeth because she's self-sufficient without being fashionable and elegant, according to Caroline. Persuaded as Miss Bingley was that Darcy admired Elizabeth, this was not the best method of recommending herself. But angry people are not always wise, true, and seeing him at last look somewhat nettled, she had all the success she expected. He was resolutely silent, however, and from a determination of making him speak, she continued. So this is obviously not working. She's just making Mr. Darcy angry. She doesn't know how to fix the situation for herself, but Darcy likes her. Darcy likes Elizabeth. So he's just going to be annoyed at what Caroline's saying, but she's angry now and she's not thinking very clearly. So she has to go on, though, after she sees that it's not working. She sees that he's annoyed, and that's, I guess, a moderate success to her. He was resolutely silent, however, and from a determination of making him speak, she continued. I remember when we first knew her in Hertfordshire how amazed we all were to find that she was a reputed beauty, and I particularly recollect your saying one night, after they had been dining at Netherfield, she a beauty, I should as soon call her mother a wit. But afterwards she seems to improve on you, and I believe you thought her rather pretty at one time. Yes, replied Darcy, who could contain himself no longer, but that was only when I first knew her, for it is many months since I have considered her as one of the handsomest women of my acquaintance. So that totally backfires on Caroline. She says, oh, you used to think she was ugly and that, she's as pretty as her mother is witty, which is not very. And, you used to, you actually thought she was pretty at one point. And then Mr. Darcy says, yeah, but it's been a couple of months since I now think her the prettiest woman that I know. He then went away, and Miss Bingley was left to all the satisfaction of having forced him to say what gave no one any pain but herself. Mrs. Gardiner and Elizabeth talked of all that had occurred during their visit as they returned, except what had particularly interested them both. The looks and behavior of everybody they had seen were discussed, except of the person who had mostly engaged their attention. They talked of his sister, his friends, his house, his fruit, of everything but himself. Yet Elizabeth was longing to know what Mrs. Gardiner thought of him, and Mrs. Gardiner would have been highly gratified by her niece's beginning the subject. So on the way back, Elizabeth and Mrs. Gardiner talk about everything except the thing which is most interesting, which is Mr. Darcy. Mrs. Gardiner would... Elizabeth wants to know what Mrs. Gardiner thought of Mr. Darcy, and Mrs. Gardiner wants Elizabeth to bring up the topic. So neither of them do, and it just kind of hangs expectantly at the end of chapter 45.